What's up, Fox10 Fox? Today we're talking about the i5-11400 and if it will bottleneck an RTX 3080. So let's hop into the specs of the i5 first. The Intel Core i5-11400 is in the 11th generation of CPUs on the Socket 1200 motherboard. It is 14 nanometers and has a recommended customer price of $182. It has 6 cores, 12 threads with a base frequency of 2.6 and a max turbo frequency of 4.4. It cannot be overclocked and only draws about 65 watts of power, which although may seem like a lot, is definitely less than most of the other Intel chips on the market. It does come with Intel UHD Graphics 730, but we're not going to be focusing on that today. And in personal tests, the thermals were quite good, with a little bit of thermal paste, Arctic Silver, and the stock cooler. Before we get into how well it does with the RTX 3080, I just want to tell you the Cinebench score, which is 8,423, which is about 500 points worse than the i9-9880H CPU, and is about 2,000 points better than the 7700K and 1,500 points from the last generation 10400. So let's hop into the games and see if the 11400 causes any issues with the 3080. The first and most recent game is Outriders, which had an average frame rate of 116. We were running the settings on everything on Ultra, and the 1% low was 87 with a 0.1% low of 13. That 13 may ring a few alarm bells, but I can guarantee you that it was probably just a lack of optimization in the game, because I'm pretty sure this game stutters on any hardware. And as you can see in the top left corner of the benchmark, we were running at 30 to 50% usage on the CPU. So I don't think that the 0.1% low was caused by the CPU. And the same thing goes with Fortnite. We had everything on Ultra with RTX on, and we averaged 65 FPS with a 1% low of 48 and a 0.1% low of 20. 20 really wasn't that bad for a 0.1% low, and again, because this is an online only game and my internet isn't super great, I can't really chalk this up to the 11400 being the offender here. Because as you can tell in the benchmark, the CPU is really laying back, maybe going up to the 30s sometimes, usually sticking in the low 20s, so I can't say that this is the CPU causing that 0.1% low either. However, I understand that those seem inconclusive. There will be some benchmarks, and I'll get into them now, that do show whether they are CPU or GPU bound and were single player. So let's talk about Watch Dogs Legion. Watch Dogs Legion, the benchmark, had an average FPS of 57. We were running it with RTX on high and everything else on ultra, with a 1% low of 44 and a 0.1% low of 39. Now, the CPU load was 85% and the GPU load was 94%. Now that is getting close to bottleneck territory, but it is still under bottleneck territory, and honestly, it just shows that the 11400 isn't holding the GPU back, but you're not spending a whole lot of money on extra unnecessary gigahertz or cores. However, I do think that 8 cores will be a good way to go in the future if you are planning to use a 3080 as time goes on. Gears 5 Next had the same thing in the benchmark. The average frame rate was 106 at 1080p with everything on Ultra and was 99% GPU bound. So it was definitely not being held back by the CPU in any way, and that is because, in my opinion, and this is just theory, it was an Xbox One title, and those things are meant to run on 4 cores, so you're not going to have any issues with a higher powered 6-core processor in this game. And Shadow of the Tomb Raider, unfortunately it does not give you 1% and 0.1% lows, but it does give you the chance to see if you're GPU bound or CPU bound. And we were GPU bound 54%, which means that the other 46% of the time we were CPU bound. Now again, this actually shows a general sense of evenness in this game. It doesn't mean that you're going to be experiencing stutters, as even the minimum CPU render was 75 FPS and the minimum GPU render was 73 FPS. We were running Shadow of the Tomb Raider once more at 1080p with everything on Ultra, including RTX. So next up is Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and with everything on Ultra at 1080p, I know I sound like a broken record, we hit 84 FPS on average with a 1% low of 63 and a 0.1% low of 48. So obviously there was no CPU bottleneck to be found. The CPU was sitting a little bit higher than other games in here, settling in around the 50s, sometimes going up to 60, but generally speaking, there was still absolutely no bottleneck whatsoever to speak of, and you'll have a fantastic time with Assassin's Creed Valhalla. So CSGO is pretty much all CPU, And that is a good test for us. And as you can tell, this was with bots, which does mean that we were putting additional strain on the CPU, but I didn't want lag from online games to be an issue here. And as you can see, in some parts of the map, we are seeing low 200s, and other parts of the map, we are seeing close to 400s. So you're not going to be seeing a whole lot of issues, even if you have a 144 Hz or 240 Hz monitor you're playing on. This was with everything on the lowest settings at 1080p, so it was definitely more CPU bound, but you just want to get as many frames as possible in CSGO. Black Ops Cold War, next we had it on once more the ultra settings with RTX on medium, and we saw an average of 117 frames per second with a 1% low of 78 and a 0.1% low of 44. And once more, as you can see in the corner, the CPU had no problem and was laying back in the low 30s to high 40s most of the time without any sort of issues whatsoever. And that concludes our gaming test. So as you can tell, this ran very, very well. Needless to say, if you're running a 3080, chances are you're also running it at a higher resolution than 1080p. You are probably looking at closer to 1440 or 4K, in which case this isn't even something you're going to have to worry about. At higher resolutions, you're going to be GPU bound all the way. It was only at 1080p where I saw some games like Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Watch Dogs really get close to becoming CPU bottlenecked, but they still didn't. And in every game I tested, there was no noticeable CPU bottleneck. So if you've got an 11400, you've got a 3080, you're going to have a great time. However, like I said, I think in the future, and if you are looking to buy an 11400 right now, I think you would be better off going with a Ryzen 8 core or an Intel 8 core if you have the extra money to spend. However, if you don't at the moment and you plan on playing with this and then resell it later on to get your 8 core processor, that is what you should do. And you'll have no problems playing with this $180 CPU on a $700 GPU. So thank you very much for watching this video. If you like this video, like, subscribe, do as you usually do, and as always, buy yourself something nice.